Salam and welcome to the final day of the Psychology of Global Crises conference. What a wild ride this has been. I hope you have enjoyed it. I certainly did. If you missed the talk, look for it on YouTube under the conference channel. The speaker I am about to introduce is not only a friend, he is also a comrade. Dr. Jamil Khader is Dean of Research and Professor of English at Bethlehem University, Palestine. He is the author of Cartographies of Transnationalism and Postcolonial Feminisms, Geography, Culture, Identity, Politics, published by Lexington Books in 2012. He is also the co-editor with Molly Rothenberg of a collection of essays on the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, titled Žižek Now, Current Perspectives in Žižek Studies, published by Polity in 2013. The title of Dr. Khader's keynote speech is Biopolitics, Reinvented Communism, and Conspiracy Theories, the COVID-19 Pandemic in Palestine.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for being here. The title of my talk today is Biopolitics, Reinvented Communism, and Conspiracy Theories, the COVID-19 Pandemic in Palestine. When Robert invited me to speak at this conference, the controversy over the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben's reflections over the Italian government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic had erupted. At the same time, the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek's ruminations on the pandemic had come out. He respectfully disagreed with Agamben, but his own ideas about disaster communism had also become the subject of a vigorous debate. Hence, I thought about speaking about these debates in relation to the situation in Palestine and the Palestinian struggle for freedom, especially since Žižek directly refers to Palestine in his comment on new forms of international solidarity that emerged in the wake of the pandemic. At the same time, Arabic popular culture during the month of Ramadan was robust in its effort to engage in the Palestinian struggle for freedom and the Palestinian ongoing Nakba. Many of the series this year were embroiled in debates about normalization, framing the ongoing Nakba in conspiracy theories that aim to implot not only an end, whether it's apocalyptic, utopian, or just normative, but a closure to this Nakba. Much like these philosophical reflections on the pandemic, these conspiracy theories depoliticize the Palestinian struggle for freedom by obfuscating the class struggle to which some inadvertently point in the name of theological apocalyptic discourses and timeless Manichaean moral cosmologies. This talk then aims to map the psychology of the pandemic crisis in Palestine onto the history of political catastrophes that have constituted the scene of Palestinian life as it is reflected in philosophical debates and controversies over popular culture. To speak about Palestine in the context of the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic in May 2020 evokes another perennial crisis, the foundational disaster of the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948 in Palestinian collective consciousness and historical memory. This year, as you all know, marks the 72nd anniversary of the ongoing Nakba. The doubling of the crisis frames the pandemic in a long history of crises, disasters, and catastrophes against which Palestinians had to struggle. At this historical juncture, in particular, Trump's deal of the century, which aims at the liquidation of the legitimate Palestinian national aspirations, rights, and sovereignty, and the Israeli government's plan to colonize and annex more Palestinian land, name the crisis disaster itself. In his introduction to Ghassan Kanafani's Palestine's Children Returning to Haifa and Other Stories, Edward Said writes that the disaster of 1948 had posited the scene itself as the very problem of Arabic literature and writing. And we can add, of course, psyche. The Nakba occupies an iconic and foundational position in the Palestinian and Arab culture, since it represents a traumatic rupture in Palestinian and Arabic consciousness, memory, and historical narrative. In his etymological analysis of the signifier Nakba in Arabic, Hassan Khader, no relation, traces the word to the same triliteral root, N-ka-ba, nun-ka-ba, Nakaba, as any of the four winds that shifts madly, wreaking havoc among the winds, so as to engulf the land and wreak great devastation. He also examines the various synonyms for the word in the Lisan al-Arab dictionary, including hadath, misfortune, na'iba, vicissitude, nauba, evil turn of fate, raziya, heavy loss, amma, cataclysmic disaster, ghashiya, oppressive misery, ja'iha, devastation, mulimma, tribulation, ariqa, وعرقة, sudden affliction, and haqqa, infliction, and nakira, grievous hardship. All these references signify the magnitude of the violence and capriciousness of this life-shattering event on the Palestinian life world. For Palestinians, the Nakba is a rupture that engendered a long historical process of settler colonialism and apartheid, dispossession and displacement, ethnic cleansing and depopulation, the diaspora, the scattering of the Palestinians into refugee camps, and the winter of exile, as Edward Said says. The Nakba, in Ahmad Saadi's words, represents, among many other things, the loss of the homeland, the disintegration of society, the frustration of national aspirations, and the beginning of a hasty process of destruction of their culture. Indeed, the Nakba has become a site of collective memory that connects all Palestinians to a specific point in time that has become for them an eternal present, end quote. It is in this context that I engage both Agamben's and Zizek's reflections on the pandemic. Drawing on Carl Schmitt's work, Agamben theorizes biopolitical power in terms of the decisive power of the sovereign ban, not only to impose a state of exception and emergency power as a normal paradigm for government that can lead to authoritarian and totalitarian governance structures. He also argues that biopower reduces the lives of the citizens to the status of bare or naked life. As you all probably know by now, Agamben spoke of COVID-19 as a flu, calling it an alleged pandemic, even though his claims were based on early data from an Italian research institute. He was trying to make the point that the alleged pandemic constitutes another ruse or pretext for the state to crack down on civil liberties and impose limitations on the freedom of the public in the name of safety and health. His second point is that, quote, people have been so habituated to live in conditions of perennial crisis and perennial emergency that they don't seem to notice that their life has been reduced to a purely biological condition. He thus states that our society no longer believes in anything but bare life. It is obvious that Italians are disposed to sacrifice practically everything, the normal conditions of life, social relationships, work, even friendships, affections, and religious and political convictions, to the danger of getting sick. Bare life and the danger of losing it is not something that unites people, but blinds and separates them. He concludes that a society that lives in a perennial state of emergency cannot be a free society. On his part, Zizek rejected Agamben's claims for grounding the important role of the state in managing public health and enforcing life-saving measures. He thus saw the pandemic as an opportunity to develop some form of disaster communism and new forms of solidarity. The pandemic, he opined, ushers a new form of communism. He writes that his notion of communism comes in not as an obscure dream, but simply as a name for what is already going on, or at least perceived by many as a necessity. That is, measures which are already being considered and even partially enforced. It's not a vision of a bright future, but more one of disaster communism as an antidote to disaster capitalism. In a clear swipe at Agamben, Zizek argues that not only should the state assume a much more active role, organizing the production of urgently needed things like masks, tests, test kits, and respirators, sequestering hotels and other resorts, quarantining or guaranteeing the minimum of survival of all new unemployed, and so on, doing all of this by abandoning market mechanisms. Invoking news about Trump's plan to take over the private sector, Zizek doubles down on his use of the term communism, claiming that many more measures of the sort will be needed, as well as local self-organization of communities, if state-run health systems collapse under too much duress or stress. It's not enough just to isolate and survive. For this to be possible, basic public services will have to continue functioning. Electricity, water, food, medicine will have to continue being available. He concludes that this is not a utopian communist vision, it is a communism imposed by the necessities of bare survival. Zizek also discusses new forms of solidarity. He notes two diametrically opposed tendencies in the context of the pandemic. On the one hand, he refers to the ideological pressure to establish clear borders and to quarantine enemies who pose a threat to our identity. On the other, he notes the potential for another and much more beneficent ideological virus that might spread and hopefully infect us. The virus of thinking of an alternative society, a society beyond nation state, a society that actualizes itself in the forms of global solidarity and cooperation, unquote. And as an example of this new form of solidarity, as a reaction to the threat posed by the coronavirus outbreak, Zizek mentions that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu immediately offered help and coordination to the Palestinian Authority. He explains that this was not out of goodness and human consideration, but for the simple fact that it is impossible to separate Jews and Palestinians there. If one group is affected, the other will inevitably also suffer. As such, Zizek states that, quote, this is a reality which we should translate into politics. Now is the time to drop the, quote, America or whoever else first motto. As Martin Luther King put it more than half a century ago, quote, we may have all come on different ships, but we are in the same boat now. While Agamben's conception of biopolitics is not radical enough, Zizek's example of new forms of solidarity misses the realities on the ground in Israel-Palestine. The management of health in Palestine is not subject to the logic of biopolitics only. In Palestine, we are dealing with the health of a population under occupation, apartheid regime, and settler colonialism. As such, the subject that the Israeli state protects is a racialized subject, embedded in the new Israeli Jewish nation-state law. When Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu states that Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people and respects the rights of all of its citizens, he's obfuscating various incompatible ideas. The rights of all citizens in such an ethnocratic polity can be neither respected nor protected, since the only democracy in the Middle East is based on securing the privileges and rights of one particular ethno-religious identity only. The hierarchical and exclusivist principles of the Israeli ethnocratic settler colonial state stand at the opposite end of the universal egalitarian ideals of inequality that deems itself to be the state of all of its citizens. Oren Yiftachel, a renowned scholar of Israeli ethnocracy, argues convincingly that Israel's democratic charade covers up a deeper ethnocratic apartheid structure. Such a structure, he points out, requires the institutionalization of racial laws that can guarantee Jewish supremacy and hegemony, equality before the law, and the redistribution of resources and rights become an elusive dream that will always be undermined at both symbolic and legal levels. In such a context, the modern biopolitical, the power to make, live, and let die, takes on a different meaning. In order that the subject of the state may live, and perhaps, quote, live well and live fully, some forms of bare and disposable lives must die. Biopolitics turns into finita politics, or as Akil Mbembe says, necropolitics. And death becomes a consequence, a necessary part of living. And such death, moreover, becomes too easily obfuscated and removed from the national scene, but it remains constitutive of this biopolitical logic. It is in this necropolitical context, make live and let die, that we can examine how Israeli authorities have weaponized the coronavirus pandemonium against Palestinians. For example, Bram Wespilwy and Amaya Al-Orza write that, quote, Israeli occupying forces have confiscated building materials for a Palestinian field clinic, shut down a COVID-19 testing facility in East Jerusalem, and intensified the military securitization of the West Bank, including the complete blockading of Bethlehem following a COVID-19 outbreak in early March. They read these measures in the context of Israel's military occupation and a neo-colonial aid regime with ever-tightening donor restrictions, which have contributed to a fragmented and underfunded health system that makes Palestinians more susceptible to pandemic. The inhumane treatment of Palestinian workers during this pandemic can also be directly linked to the logic of disposability and elimination at the core of this necropolitical regime. According to Middle East Eye, 2 months ago, in March, Israeli soldiers dumped a Palestinian worker at a checkpoint on the border of the West Bank, who was shivering from fever and barely able to breathe. The report said that the man had been showing signs of the coronavirus over the past 4 days and was recently tested for the virus. But before the man, allegedly a resident of Nablus, could receive his test results, his Israeli employer reportedly called the authorities, who picked him up and dropped him on the other side of the Beit Sira checkpoint, which connects central Israel and the occupied West Bank. So a local Palestinian worker says, it's like we are slaves to them. They use us when they need us, and when they are finished, they throw us away like trash. Since the crisis began, Israeli soldiers have actively obstructed the emergency response for Palestinians by shutting down multiple clinics and continuing their practice of arbitrary house demolitions. Zizek's reference to Netanyahu's call should be read in the context of the cooperation between the Israeli government and Palestinian security services in the post-Oslo era. However, actions on the ground, as we have seen, tell a different story. It doesn't foresee a new form of international solidarity between colonizer and colonized, occupier and occupied, but the opportunistic manipulation of the pandemic to actualize antiquated colonial dreams of annexation, disposition, and displacement. As a recent dispatch put it eloquently, COVID-19 is not a peacemaker. In a personal communication, Zizek recognized the mistake he made using this example, but we might still salvage a sense of this international cooperation in the many examples of international scientific cooperation and collaboration in research about the pandemic. Agamben and Zizek fell back on their own default familiar narratives and theories to speculate about the pandemic and its consequences. In their responses, moreover, Agamben and Zizek positioned themselves in antagonistic ways in relation to conspiracy theories about the COVID-19 pandemic. In the case of Agamben, it seems that his ready-made paradigm plays into alt-right and populist conspiracy theories about government takeover and the extension of draconian and totalitarian state powers over the population. In fact, in some of his rejoinders to the debate, Agamben goes as far as claiming that recent measures are not some sort of malevolent top-down conspiracy, but examples of, quote, objective conspiracies that allow governments who want to introduce specific measures to take advantage of the realities on the ground. However, the problem is that many governments have not yet declared the state of emergency in their countries. Perhaps, as McGowan argues, the state and capital are not yet completely aligned. Perhaps, as others have noted, altruism and care for the other and healthy collective is still central to the formation of individual consciousness. While Agamben's response overlaps with some alt-right theories about state control, Zizek rejects any attempt to draw any hidden meaning from the pandemic. Zizek states that, however, we should resist the temptation to treat the ongoing epidemic as something that has a deeper meaning. The cruel but just punishment of humanity for the ruthless exploitation of other forms of life on Earth. If we search for such a hidden message, we remain pre-modern. We treat our universe as a partner in communication. Even if our very survival is threatened, there's something reassuring in the fact that we are punished. The universe, or even somebody out there, is engaging with us. We matter in some profound way. The really difficult thing to accept is the fact that the ongoing epidemic is the result of natural contingency at its purest, that it just happened and hides no deeper meaning. This discussion of conspiracy theories is central to the ways in which the Palestinian struggle for freedom is framed in Arabic popular culture. In some Ramadan TV programs, conspiracy theories were invoked to imply not only an end, but a closure to the Palestinian Nakba. Much like Agamben's and Zizek's philosophical reflections on the pandemic, however, these conspiracy theories depoliticize the Palestinian struggle for freedom by obfuscating the class struggle in the name of theological apocalyptic discourses and timeless Manichaean moral cosmologies. One of these series is The End, Al-Nihaya, an Egyptian dystopian science fiction thriller that draws on anti-Semitic and Masonic conspiracy theories, come apocryphal Islamic apocalyptic myths about the Antichrist, the false Messiah, Al-Masih al-Dajjal, and Zionist world domination. Such theories, as Jovan Byford writes in a different context, quote, have their own seductive appeal, since they have taken the form of a complex tales of secret identities, covert plans, and arcane knowledge. They are also further mapped onto the classic Manichaean morality tale about the battle between good and evil. The fight is therefore not simply between two groups with differing ideological leanings. The cosmology of the conspiracy theorist is very often deeply morally and effectively charged, seeing their work as a true battle between primal good versus primal evil. However, such theories should be rejected outright. They do not only displace rationality into the realm of the irrational and the mythical, but also depoliticize the Palestinian struggle for freedom. The End had captured the imagination of audiences throughout the Arab world this Ramadan season. It was ranked among the first 3 most popular programs and has generated a lot of discussion in social media about its futuristic technology and debt to Hollywood science fiction and dystopian films. More recently, they have debated its debt to Wassini al-A'raj's novel, The Last Arab. The End was also lumped into the debate over normalization in this year's programming and was attacked by the Israeli Foreign Ministry for its anti-normalization position. The End is premised on the fictional idea that the Arab world would become a united superpower and Israel would be destroyed less than a century to its establishment, that is, in less than 30 years. In its place, Al-Quds, Jerusalem conglomerate, will be created and will be under total Arab control. Some contrasted the daring futuristic scenario with the utter impotence of the Arab world today to offer any viable solution to the Palestinian struggle for freedom and the ongoing Nakba. Others thought it was enough that the program managed to provoke and infuriate Israel. However, these visceral reactions completely ignore the dystopian context in which these themes are developed. It is puzzling, for example, to read that the series, quote, contains futuristic themes replete with hope and optimism for the entire Arab region. There is nothing redeeming about the post-liberation dystopia imagined in the series. As far as the theme of the liberation of Al-Quds conglomerate is concerned, the message of the series is even more depressing. The series does not only substitute one form of domination in Al-Quds conglomerate for another, more importantly, the Palestinians are completely erased from Al-Quds conglomerate itself. Part of the excitement about the end in social media can be attributed to the total disconnect between the nostalgic celebration of past Arab victory and the dystopian present of the Arab world in 2120. In a controversial scene that received wide accolades in Arab social media and drew the ire of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, a history teacher inculcates in his students the events that led to the destruction of Israel. By 2048, the teacher explains what was known as the Arab countries became a political and economic power to reckon with. Moreover, the US empire had collapsed and was divided into three different warring blocs. Consequently, Arab countries were able to defeat their archenemy, the Zionist state of Israel, in the War of the Liberation of Al-Quds, less than a century to its establishment. Israel's Jewish citizens, the teacher clarifies, were relocated, and it's not clear whether it was forcibly or voluntarily, to their European countries of origin and other destinations around the world. However, the nostalgic celebration of Arab triumphalism is short-lived. The security forces of Energy Co., one of the corporations that rule over Al-Quds conglomerate, soon ambush the underground school for violating the selective education code of the jurisdictional administration of the noble Al-Quds conglomerate. They arrive in a space shuttle, blast the school's door, kill one of the children who was trying to escape, round up the others, and ship them to a labor camp and the corporation headquarters, and banish the teacher to one of the nuclear wastelands in the southern part of West Africa. The series is set in the dystopian reality of the Arab world in the post-liberation era. Arab countries, as we know them today, do not exist anymore in the geopolitical map of the dystopian world in 2120. They were dissolved and became a part of the Western Bloc, which includes Europe and other countries, in a world controlled by corporations and technologies. Ironically, the liquidation of Israel in the end did not bring an end to the oppression in Palestine or the Arab world in general. Around 2090, Al-Quds conglomerate became the main site for a robocide, the genocide in which humans eliminated all robots after one of them terminated its owner. Consequently, laws were passed to ban the production of robots and the development of AI. The series merely substitutes one form of domination and apartheid for another. After the elimination of the majority of the robots, moreover, the all-powerful Energy Co. was established in Al-Quds conglomerate. The corporation employs algorithmic governance using surveillance technology, facial recognition software, and military drones to track and control citizens. Its security forces, moreover, regularly attack and brutalize citizens. One form of oppression is gone, but Palestine and the Arab world do not live in liberty yet. The most puzzling aspect about this triumphalist history of the liberation of Al-Quds conglomerate and the dystopian world of the series is the absence of any trace of the Palestinians or Palestinian culture. The obverse side of the obliteration of Israel seems to be the erasure of the Palestinians. Even in the region that metonomically refers to their ancestral homeland, the Palestinians are nowhere to be found. The people who live in Al-Quds conglomerate speak Egyptian colloquial Arabic, and no one seems to be taking pride in their Arabic cultural heritage or Palestinian identity. Furthermore, the residents of Al-Quds conglomerate are represented in very negative terms. The global capitalist class and elites who live in the oasis megalopolis in an undisclosed location look down upon them and refer to them as uncivilized and barbarians. The son of the president of Energy Co., who lives in the oasis, also told the protagonist that life in Al-Quds is not fit for human beings. Indeed, one major plotline in the series deals with the protagonist's task to invent an energy source that can power a dome that will protect humanity in the oasis from the hordes and barbarians. Until the last few episodes of the series, the most interesting aspect of the plot had been its unwavering identification of Al-Quds conglomerate with the struggles of the people who are excluded from the system that the oasis elites and global capitalist class want to create for themselves. The dystopian format of the series thus links the conditions of the worst off in Al Quds conglomerate to the class struggle and other profound issues in the region and the world. The series illuminates and raises questions about these profound issues that have affected humanity in the last few decades. These issues include not only the polarization of wealth and the cupola created in the global apartheid, but also neoliberal algorithmic governance, the naturalization of AI as both human surrogates and sex bots, the rise of megalopolis cities as corporations, renewable energy, and ecological sustainability. The end thus manages to represent the radical changes sweeping the Arab world through the screen of fantasy. It filters Arab audiences' unconscious fears and anxieties about the traumatic sociopolitical and cultural crises that are tearing the Arab world apart through traditional dystopian and science fiction tropes and novum. However, in the last few episodes, the series reverts to apocalyptic fabulation and religious mystification. The narrative shifts completely to the story of a cult whose leader is modeled after the image of the Antichrist in Islamic tradition. Commentators and social media picked up on this theme and even praised the series for courageously taking on the quote Zionist Masonic plot for world domination. Some of these conspiracy theories are directly linked to conspiracy theories about the COVID-19 pandemic as well. The fact that they are using COVID-19 in order to build the new world by killing, the majority of the world's population and leaving precisely 500 million people to build this new world. The unfortunate thing about the series is that it misses a wonderful opportunity to engage the universal dimensions of the Palestinian struggle for freedom, which is the only way to rethink liberation for all in Israel and Palestine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamil, for this powerful talk. Okay, we're going to begin the live Q&A right now, and I encourage participants to submit their questions through the Q&A tool on Zoom. But as they do that, I want to begin with a few comments and a question. So in addition to the ongoing Nakba in Palestine and the Arab world, I want to add two other signifiers that I think also important, of course, in Naksa in 67, in terms of its impact on the Arab psyche, and of course, the different variations of intifadas that we've been seeing since the 80s. So in terms of regarding the question of solidarity, I want to begin with the nationwide protests instigated by the killing of George Floyd by the police, because we're seeing, of course, the ongoing militarization of the police in the United States, but also in other parts of the world. And the connection to Palestine is clear. The IDF trains the American police. So if you can speak about this question of solidarity between the experience of African Americans in the United States and, of course, Palestinians, and this solidarity between the IDF and the police, right?
Well, at one level, thanks, Robert. Thank you for the question and for the comment. The other reference, obviously, the Naksa of 67 and the Intifadas are major landmarks, obviously, in Palestinian consciousness. But, in the sort of history of the Palestinian struggle and the consciousness of the magnitude of the catastrophe of the Nakba remains really central. And, as scholars have struggled to come up with a term that can describe the realities on the ground, they have shifted between many different sort of terms. As you know, the occupation is a very problematic term. In international law, it's not prohibited or forbidden. So the problem is that it has been simply going on for forever. People, experimented with the term settler colonialism and other terms, but I think the ongoing Nakba has become a term that many people
accept as an apt descriptor of what's going on, since it establishes a continuity in the struggle and history of the Palestinians in terms of, the settler colonial project, disposition and displacement, the apartheid regime, land confiscation, depopulation, etc. Now, obviously, we have been following the George Floyd case, and we have been following the protests, looking at what's going on in different major cities in the United States. And the issue of Black Palestinian solidarity has been central to the way that people have tried to connect and link the Palestinian struggle to the struggle of many colonized populations around the world. Now, the issue for me is a little bit kind of complex because you have some Palestinian scholars who described or used the term Black struggle to describe the Palestinian struggle. So they use the Black struggle as a metaphor for the legitimacy of the Palestinian struggle. And we can understand why. Obviously, to try to appeal to more international audiences, etc. Other people have used the experiences of American Indians and other indigenous populations in order to draw these links. However, I do not really like the metaphorics of it. I don't like the way that people have used these metaphors to describe these struggles. I think what we need to work on is the attempt to find how these struggles are as the obverse side of the same struggle within the global capitalist system. I think that your reference to the linkages and cooperation between the Israeli military establishment and the American police, the training of many American, police forces in the United States has been pointed out, and I think we can look at it that way. But it has created, these kind of problems, and I think we need to think a little bit about the meaning of this solidarity and how to proceed with it. If you read, Afro pessimists, for example, they're not really happy about the way that, activists draw these links between them, and I can understand to a certain extent, and therefore my sort of point has always been to try to think about these struggles as the obverse side of the same fundamental antagonism in the global capitalist system. I think we will avoid these kind of aporias in articulating our struggles and their uniqueness, but also in their universality.
Thank you for that. Here's a question from participant Rawia. Is Agamben that far off, though perhaps unintentionally? Israel uses the claim to be eradicating terrorists conspiracy to justify their quarantining off of the West Bank, the imprisonment of Palestinians, often with no charges or evidence, imposing curfew and no roaming orders, conducting violent interrogations, and so on.
Yeah, well, thanks, Ravi. I think the the point that I was trying to make is that, and I think that some other scholars in Palestinian studies have made the point that the state of exception and state of emergency developed by Agamben is not really adequate to describe what is going on in the occupation. And this is sort of the premise of my talk, that the occupation is not simply a kind of a seemingly democratic regime or structure of power that suddenly sort of creates spaces for exception in order to actualize all of these antiquated colonial dreams that I've spoken about. And therefore, I understand what Rabia is saying, and I agree with some of the things that she is pointing to. But the premise itself, the beginning of it is really the assumption that I'm working with is that the occupation is not really equivalent to and cannot be described in terms of the state of exception the way that Agamben talks about it, even though Agamben uses the state of exception in order to point out the totalitarian aspects of democracies. But the occupation, there's nothing democratic really about the occupation Palestine.
So for Agamben, the state is the problem. For Zizek, the state is the solution in some sense with disaster communism. You also talk about, of course, the show, the Musalsal from Ramadan at the end, where you have an Arab superstate that erases the kind of universal um, aspect of Palestinian struggle. And so you also talked about going beyond the nation state. And so, how do you see the end of Israeli apartheid, given those tensions that you talk about?
Yeah, well, there's no really, I mean, you cannot think about a political solution at this sort of moment, but we can think about the way that there's a real, obfuscation of the available solution that could lead us somewhere, like the two-state solution, and now the plan sort of talk about annexation in July and the new sort of deal of the century obviously will threaten the liquidation of the Palestinian struggle. But if you go back to the sort of the problem with Nihaya, the end, and the issue of the superstate, I wrote another sort of longer article about the Nihaya that came out in Middle East Monitor, and there I also point out, I didn't mention this in the talk, but the program itself was produced by Synergy, a company, a production company, media company in Egypt that has connection to the Egyptian intelligence. So it's not clear for me where the state really, where the program stands on the question of the state. Is the state really the answer to this, or is the dystopia that is described in the program really a displacement or a metaphor for the totalitarian state in Egypt today? It's not really clear, but that is something that I've heard in an interview with somebody asked them, and I wasn't really sure whether it came out after, because it came out after my critique, but I wasn't sure whether they were raising the same question or issue. The Yeah, so for me, it's and the other thing that I was trying to sort of point out in my talk, and that's where I brought in all of these, obnoxious and horrible anti-Semitic, conspiracy theories. The question of what I call in the article as Islamofuturism. And it turns out actually that the script writer of the program was a member of allegedly the Muslim Brotherhood. So I wasn't sure, but you could see it, you could detect it in the program itself. So in terms of the state, Zizek obviously, like many Marxists, believe that the state plays a role. He jokingly says all the time that, he doesn't want to spend time thinking about electricity and power and cultivating food or whatever. He wants somebody else to take care of it so he can, actualize Marx's dream, right, of, maximizing the potential of human beings. Just spend your time doing what you really like to do in a productive way. So I see the issue of the state as a problem also, but you have to take a critical distance from it, right? It's not just simply that the state is there and you support the state, etc. But there is a critique of the state, and in terms of what he calls disaster communism, right? In terms of thinking about new forms of governance. And I think at one point he mentioned Chavez and other sort of populist leaders on the left that use the state in order to mobilize people. So it's obviously a thorny question, and the program does not address it, or my paper doesn't really address it. But my interest on the other side is in the universality of the struggle is not really about state structures. It's about how we can think about the universal dimension of our identities, how we can avoid speaking, and in the Palestinian context as well, not to speak of identity politics, to question them, to try to interrogate the structures of victimization and the Olympics, or the victimization Olympics, as I call it. Who's more victim in the world in order to win points. and obviously, there's much to think about in terms of how we can effect liberation beyond the sort of political solution. That's what I sort of just want to say. Thinking about the ideological investment that we are making in our identities and our cultures and our heritage that really obfuscate a perhaps a viable solution, which to me is really nothing beyond the one state solution. Now, what would that be, the one state solution? I really don't know. If it's the annexation, it's an imperial sort of structure. It's unfortunate. If it's something where everybody sort of lives in equality and egalitarian sort of system, then obviously we'll be heading towards the right direction.
One thing that's clear to me from the show Al Nihaya is a critique of a certain historical experience that we're very familiar with in the Arab world, which is that of the Pan-Arabist or Arab Socialist Project of Nasser and others.
Yeah.
And the kind of, which is, it was an anti-colonial struggle, but the fantasy of Arab socialism also was sort of undergirded by anti-Semitism, and it led, of course, to the establishment of the police state in many of Arab countries. So the police state that we have currently in Egypt was pretty much invented by Nasser, right? So that's a kind of a contradiction there, I think, in that fantasy of Arab socialism and how it leads to actually authoritarian structures.
This is
So
Robert. This is really the point that I was trying to make in the article and the talk. To some extent, there's a disconnect between what the show is saying, could be construed as saying, and what people took out of the show. I mean, as I said, people were celebrating it. There's like, if it outrages Israel, then it's really enough for us. Like this kind of visceral reaction. But the show is really complex, and many people responding to the show and many other shows really essentialized it. And think about what we do in cultural studies. You don't really essentialize the object of study. I mean, there's no one single meaning that you can derive from the show. As a text, it generates many different meanings, but everybody really wanted it to say one thing. And this was really the problem with it. So I would, again, just to keep in mind that there's that critique that of the show itself, which I think I tried to capture, but also in the way that it was received, which was more problematic to me. That added another level or layer of ambiguity to the analysis itself.
okay, here's another question from the audience. Your wonderful review of novels suggests the power of new imaginative possibilities. How much do these possibilities penetrate public culture in Palestinian territories and even in Israel, where there is no uniformity of support for Netanyahu? With the situation looking so bleak, at least when viewed in the news, please correct this view as you see it, can the non-political paths impact politics?
Again, it's really a tough question. There are attempts among many Arab novelists, including Palestinian ones, to sort of reimagine the history of the struggle, to rethink the relationship between the self and the other. Many people have done it. Many people are doing it. Even the Arab Booker Prize, have really popularized many of these novels that really question the traditional way of looking at the Palestinian question. Even this Ramadan itself, I mentioned Al Nihaya, but the debate about normalization in these Ramadanic programs really was involved about 5 or 6 different programs. One of them was Exit 7, a Saudi comedy program, which was vilified by many Palestinian activists. And I, again, don't agree, because in the scene that people sort of focused on as an example of normalization, you had a debate between 2 men. One of them is pro-normalization, the other is against it. And the daughter of the person who advocates normalization, who is really an ardent Palestinian supporter. So, okay, NBC has connections with the TV station, has connections with the Saudi government. But that doesn't mean that we can pin one meaning into the show. Another program, a Kuwaiti program called Harun, which is based on the historical life of a Jewish midwife in Bahrain, I think. The same thing, I mean, the questions that were raised are questions that many Palestinian activists have been sort of fighting. The conflation of Jew, Israeli, Zionist, Hebrew, whatever. Like you have to go back again over and over and say, well, sorry, there's nothing wrong about talking about the humanity of the Jews in the Arab world or in the world in general. I really found it really like when I was talking to people and thinking about writing a piece about it, do I really have to sort of go defend the humanity of the Jew? Come on, this is not something that we really want to talk about. There's a political problem, but beyond that political problem, we cannot sort of get into oversweeping generalization. Actually, I tell you, Robert and the audience, at one moment, there were other programs that were lumped into this normalization debate. One of them was called the Garden of Jerusalem, about Hilarion Capucci, a Syrian bishop who was in Jerusalem. But the program begins or frames the story of the struggle of this bishop in the context of the liberation of Aleppo by the Assad regime in 2016. So how do you want people to really react or respond to this? Or the other Jordanian TV, which is called Khawabi, that is large jars, talks about the Palestinians in the 1920s completely divorced of all political context. There's no, Zionist movement. There's no British colonialism. It's just these sort of Palestinian peasants, fallahin, worrying about who's going to marry whom and who's going to kill whom and who's going to inherit what. Completely depoliticize it. So for me, actually, people who are bringing up these normalization debates, to me was more sort of interesting and actually more truthful to what we are going through, not sort of escape into some sort of escapist solutions to history, a pre-political kind of image of the past instead of engaging what's going on at the current historical moment.
Yeah, and I want to add regarding the conflation between, Jew and Israeli. One of the things that Hatem Bazian talked about is the humanization of the human is actually dehumanizing, because from whose perspective is it, right? So that's something that's interesting to think about too, these discourses of humanizing and the effect that they have. But I want you to, if you can, Jamil, can you hear me? I see you.
Yes,
Okay.
I'm with you, sorry.
So if you can speak to this alignment that we've been seeing under COVID-19 between critical theory on the left and conspiracy on the right, which is something you touched upon with your critique of Agamben, because something we're really seeing now that almost like the two are gonna merge or something, critical theory and conspiracy. I don't want to even call it conspiracy theory because that's elevating it to the level of theory. So I'm just gonna say conspiracy and critical theory. And so if you can talk a little bit more about that phenomenon.
Conspiracy or outlooks. Well, I mean, it's a theory, just the term that experts and scholars talk about. I mean, it was really stunning to sort of see how these discourses converge at one moment, and I was really surprised that Agamben used the term objective conspiracy to talk about these measures as if really there is a real, plan by these states to take over power structures, more of them, crack down on liberty, and simply actualize the dream of or the nightmare that he talks about in terms of the state of exception. And I thought that, when I was reading about it, and because I was following a lot of these conspiracy theories in the Arab world with regards to COVID-19, whether it's, the role of Bill Gates, the role of the Zionist Masonic, conspiracy, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, there's plenty of them there, the New World Order. So I was a little bit kind of, surprised to see it. And I thought that because originally I really wanted to talk about these conspiracy theories. That when we had that mixer with other speakers, one of our colleagues said that the problem with the COVID-19 was for him the fact that we don't know the plot, that we don't know the end of the narrative. And I sort of said in the comment, well, actually, for me, it's a problem of falling back on default narrative frames that provide easy and ready-made answers to the kind of difficult questions we are experiencing. And so it seemed to me that, because in the end, what Zizek and what Agamben are producing are narratives. They are stories they are telling themselves about how reality is constituted, how politics is played out. It's not really far-fetched to think about it in terms of this narratological frame, that you can really think about them, their theories and conspiracy theories, as part of the same kind of world of discourse. So, but again, what I was trying to do is to sort of say that I can engage Agamben at that sort of rational level. Okay, I can, read Agamben, I can disagree with him. And it may sound that I am accusing him of being conspiratorial, but what actually I'm saying is that whatever he's saying can be played into the hands of those alt-right and populist discourses that aim at critiquing the government and the deep state and whatever. It sounds like something they would really latch on. With conspiracy theories, I don't really, as I said, we should reject them outright. There's no discussion there. We can them, we can understand them, we can understand why people look for them, why people try to find them. It makes their life easier. It gives them answers, easy answers to more complex questions. And today, in the context of a world in which most people don't have really decisions about important matters in their daily lives, all of these matters are taken by governments or ministers in closed meetings or whatever. There's a sense that people do not really own their story, their narrative. They don't have control over their lives. So in that sense, I'm sort of urging critical distance and a critique of the theory, but also at the same time, we should engage conspiracy theories, but always with the intention of showing how irrational they are, that we cannot really accept.
Thank you very much. Here's a question from the audience. This is from Gordana Jovanovic. Thank you very much for your plea for liberation, understood as a liberation for all. Don't we need for such an approach a rehabilitation of the grand narratives of emancipation which have been discredited in theory, postmodernism, but beyond that, universality has been perverted also by suspension of international law, or what is pragmatically described as double standards? What would you say on that?
Well, I mean, if I understood the question correctly, the grand narratives that we have talked about, obviously they have their limitations, and we're always urging a kind of rethinking of these narratives. I personally, follow Zizek's critique of these master narratives, the question of postmodern difference, etc., relativization of identity, how to think about truth in the context of postmodernity is a very difficult question. But I think that what I learned from Zizek and Lacan in terms of the universality, and which I talk about in terms of concrete universality, is that universal dimension of identity that we should all seek to actualize. We all come from different cultures. We have to understand how our identities relate to different cultures. But beneath that sort of cultural particularity, there is that universal dimension. And it's not really, and let me just make it clear, when Zizek talks about concrete, he's not talking about the liberal, neutral universality, where you have multiple, narratives that fight each other, whatever, in kind of an equal relationship. We are talking about a different sense where you are dealing with this image of the concrete universal from the perspective of the people who are excluded from the global capitalist system itself. This is the measure that has to be, for me, instituted and followed. So this is the reason why I talk about the worst off, or to use the concept that Zizek sometimes borrows from Rancière, the part of no part. Okay, we have to think about this discourse of universality from the truth of the experience of the people who don't have a place in that system, the people who are disposable, right? Who are, to use also what Butler calls unmournable people. Okay, and we have seen that obviously in the critique of African American experiences in United States and white supremacy structures. So once you start measuring that universal from the perspective of the people who have been excluded from the system, you can start connecting all of these struggles together because their experience is really the truth of the global capitalist system in its brutality and barbarization and victimization of the weak and vulnerable.
Thank you, Jamil. As you are very well aware, Zizek has
Probably
been.
needs more time to sort of think
Sorry.
about, but okay.
Yeah, so I thought you stopped there, but I think it was getting cut. But I wanted to ask you because I know you've written about this. Zizek being accused of being Islamophobic and racist and sexist and all those charges. For you personally, what makes Zizek an important theorist for thinking about the Palestinian struggle for liberation and other similar struggles?
Well, again, because he had really engaged the issue of the struggle itself in Palestine from that egalitarian perspective, by which he seeks liberation for everyone, not only for one group. That all people can unlearn some of these fantasies that we invest in that can determine the way we act unconsciously in ways that can be very destructive. So he engaged, the occupation at that sort of systematic level. He talked about, various aspects of the Palestinian struggle and the settler colonial project and apartheid regime in the occupied territories. And obviously, to call Zizek an Islamophobe is really ridiculous. And sometimes I started in the last, year to refuse even to engage it just because people who write about this, with all due respect, do not seem to be engaging Zizek at the level of his thesis. It's just sort of kind of hearsay. I think he's saying this, or the way that they misinterpret it without really going back to the text and showing exactly what he's doing. One of the things that I would sort of, advise and caution against is not to read his work, even when his language sounds like a journalistic language. He's not really using these terms in some simple sort of vernacular way. He grounds everything he says in his Lacanian dictionary, in his Lacanian grammar. So anything that he says about the monstrosity of the neighbor comes from a typical Lacanian tradition. It's not just something that, oh, he's calling the neighbor or the Muslim refugee a monster. When he talks about culture and cultural differences, he grounds it in the idea of jouissance. It's clear, every culture is based on a notion of jouissance. It's organized differently. And I don't see that offensive. And it really baffles me that, and I think that he on that a lot of people who really defend him and talk about his work objectively, are Muslims or come from Muslim backgrounds, but the people who attack him are sort of liberal Westerners. And what I do in my work, I always engage him critically and always write to him when I have something that I disagree with him about. It's not really like, and I think that he appreciates that. the last piece that I've been working on, maybe I shouldn't talk about it, but I'll just mention it quickly. Hegel's conception of Islam and the way that Zizek really reactualizes Hegel's kind of what was described by people as of Islam. If you look at Zizek's, a glance at the archives of Islam, it's a great text. I would sort of urge anyone who accuses Zizek of Islamophobia to see how he rehabilitates, reactualizes Hegel's radical analysis of there's nothing wrong with that. We all engage in these kinds of debates. So what he's doing. I hope that this article will be published sometime soon, and hopefully you guys will be able to read it and see what I say about the way that he engages the universality of Islam, as well as the political ambiguity of political Islam as well.
Thank you for that. And I think to add to that, it's important that we engage critically with any thinker and move beyond this urge to cancel people, which is a very common thing to do today, right? Cancel culture. So this is a quote recently from Netanyahu, where he said they need to acknowledge that they, of course, the Palestinians, need to acknowledge that we control security in all areas. If they consent to all this, then they will have an entity of their own that President Trump defines as a state, right? And it's very interesting that he uses the word consent there, which is, of course, paradoxical given that it's a forced choice. So I don't see where the consent comes in here. There's, of course, the context of the corruption charges against him, which for some reason, and you probably know more about this, haven't affected him that much. If you can comment on this and in the context of Trump's relationship with him and what's going on, and also if you see any potential for a radical leftist government in Israel making a difference, or if that's just too utopian.
I really, again, I'm a literary critic, I'm a literary scholar, I'm another political analyst. I sort of draw what are happening around within sort of a particular approach. But the thing, whatever he said about consent should not be really an issue, shouldn't be even stated, because isn't that really what Gramsci says? You are interpolated anyway, so the consent is there. But I mean, that's part of the problem with the Palestinian discourse. You have that split between the official governmental discourse and the popular civil society discourse. That adds to that sort of problem. So the consent obviously probably can be attributed to more of that sort of formal sector of the government. As I said in the paper, and all scholars in the field talk about the cooperation between the Israelis and the Palestinian security forces. There's no secret there. Everybody talks about that. There's recently, the issue of the funding and funds and money that has been controversial. Now there's also something about banks attacking, allowing the Israeli military to seize certain bank accounts or whatever money if it were directed to Palestinian prisoners. Again, there are many things that are happening here, but obviously, the Palestinian authority is hostage to this kind of dynamics. They are between the sort of the hammer of the occupation and then the anvil of civil society. The situation is very difficult in terms of the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu. I described that in 2016 article about Trump's authoritarian capitalism. That's how I refer to it. I don't use the term fascism. The tendency there to sort of split democracy from capitalist structures, because now democracy doesn't really serve the interest of the global capitalist system. And I see something similar in Israel, and I think that I also wrote about that in the context of the new Israeli nation state law. So again, there are, and many sort of levels of interest here. Trump invokes many anti-Semitic tropes and metaphors that do not bother in the least Netanyahu and the Israeli government, because it serves the interests of the Israeli government. In the inauguration of the American embassy in Jerusalem, they even allowed an anti-Semite evangelist to speak, right? So there's that kind of weird collaboration between these different kind of forces in order to simply protect and extend the interests of the government, now with the plans of the annexation, which is going to be really devastating. And I don't know what's really going to happen. If you follow the news, there have been skirmishes recently. People are not happy about this. There have been several attacks. And obviously, it's really, and I read some warnings about another possible, not intifada, but at least outbreak of violence. This consent, again, going back to consent, people are not going to simply um, take it sitting. Obviously, it seems that, and they know this, and I guess, are preparing for the worst possible scenario. So hopefully, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, the situation is grim, but as long as we stick at least to the standards and the conventions of international law, the two-state solution could be a framework to sort of start with, even though now many people talk about the two-state solution as anti-Semitic. I mean, New York Times even published a piece like this a while back, about the end of Israel. So this is the reason why in the current project I'm working on, Rethinking Liberation in Israel Palestine, I sort of want to engage not only the political aspect, which is, again, it's not the primary target of my work, but the kind of libidinal investment, the fantasies that we have about identity and culture and heritage and tradition and history that shape the way that people think about this. Perhaps there we can sort of begin to traverse that fantasy and, look for some sort of way out.
In other words, we have to be free on a subjective level before we engage politically with liberation. I'm going to end with a question from Rauya, and if you can, in your answer, uh, perhaps talk about solidarity and how, people in the rest of the world can be in solidarity in the struggle. So Rauya asks, does the end, al-Nihaya, initially position Palestine as the object cause of desire of Arab unification? In other words, if Palestine is liberated, then the Arab world can finally be reunited after a series of occupations. Or Arab unification cannot occur until Palestine is liberated. Then is the end arguing against or beyond this desire to unify by replacing one form of oppression for another?
Uh, Very interesting question from Rabia. The thing is that the series really begins, the first episode, with a sense of triumphalism. That we were united, and we conquered our arch enemy, and we are here now, and we have liberated Jerusalem. So at one level, yes, as if that liberation of Jerusalem is the sort of Palestine as the object of desire of Arab subjectivity. But again, when you look at the series itself, there's a complete disconnect from that sort of perception of or romanticization of liberation in Jerusalem, because in the end it's really, but you replace Israeli apartheid with is another form of apartheid, is another form of domination, is another form of oppression. So at one, and again, as I said before, the series is so ambiguous on many things that it's really difficult to sort of get where it stands on these issues. Because at one level, you could say that what actually the series is saying is that, like, Lacanian idea that we are born into domination. It's inevitable. We'll be replacing one master for the other. But on the other, you could say, well, there's a possibility of a different form of power, but we don't see it. They just simply replace it with a dystopian kind of big brother entity, corporations and what have you. So I'm not really sure about the intentions. If there are sort of ever intentions, intentional fallacies, we shouldn't be guessing. But what I would say is I would encourage people, especially those who speak and understand Arabic, to watch it and figure it on their own. Because honestly, it's nothing like watching a program on your own and coming to your own conclusion, and then you can sort of read my piece and you can engage with me also in a debate and critically. The thing is that because of those different contradictions and the way that the program was set up, its funding, its relationship to Egyptian intelligence, its attitude, as you said, to Arab socialism, its sort of investment, libidinal investment in the Palestinian question, all of these clash. Get any coherent idea from the show, except in the end, which is really what ruined it for me, bring in all of this apocryphal, apocalyptic, antichrist discourse that simplified whatever remnants of the class struggle that we could have salvaged from the show and read it in, or give it some credit. I said in the article, I'm not dismissing the show. Let's give it a chance. Let's read it because there's something positive. But after the last few issues, I really got, I didn't think that that was really a smart move on their part. But again, adding to that the Islamic level of history and interpretation, which obfuscated even more. Now, in terms of solidarity, people around the world, have engaged in solidarity in different forms. You cannot tell people. For me, I usually hesitate and I don't sort of instruct people. I don't posit myself as a master who can tell people how to do. People of conscience can always find ways of articulating their opinions and their outrage about what's happening. Always find ways of expressing themselves, getting together with other people in order to form some sort of pressure. Part of it, again, is, again, thinking along the internationalist Marxist tradition to find an international movement, probably that is founded on the understanding of that concrete universality, on a critique of the system from the position of those people who are disposable. And this is really my philosophy. I don't want you just to talk about Palestine. I wanted to talk about Palestine in the context of other problems in the world. Connect the Palestinian struggle to other struggles around the world, because there are also oppressed people in Israel, there are oppressed people in the Arab world, there are oppressed people in everywhere. And we should be able to connect these struggles together as, again, the obverse side of the same fundamental antagonism. And if we manage to do that, I think we can affect a transformative change in the system itself, and hopefully be able to clear space for some sort of egalitarian thinking and action.
Very well said. So on that note, I want to thank you on behalf of everyone, and I hope you will join us on Slack to answer any questions or to engage with the participants. شكرا يا معلم.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And congratulations on a great conference. That was really wonderful. Excellent.
I hope you're going to be joining us, on the crisis.
Yeah, I downloaded it. I'll join you.
Great. All right. See you.